Every once in a while, I'll take out my PlayStation 3 collection, and there is one game that jumps out. Among dozens of cases with either English or Dutch descriptions on the back, that of Uncharted Drake's Fortune is the only one I can hardly read. The French language reminds me of a random day during high school, a long bus ride to a country 300 kilometers away, within my pocket exactly 20 euros, given by my parents for the purpose of buying food. My PlayStation 3 was less than 6 months old. The number of games I owned you could count on one hand. Finishing our objectives within the city, we were finally given some free time to explore. Naturally, the first place my classmates and I ran off to was a random game store, eager to check out some demos and see what else we'd come across. I stumbled upon Uncharted Drake's Fortune, knowing nothing about it except for what the cover and those images on the back hinted at. An adventure in the jungle, a man with a gun, but at this moment more important than anything, a sticker displaying the price tag of 19 euros. Reassured by a friend of mine that he had heard great things about this game, for a second I hesitated if I was really just about to bite the bullet. My budget as a young teenager was extremely limited, and rarely did I ever get a golden opportunity like this to acquire a game I technically wouldn't even have to pay for myself. As a consequence, I sat in the back of the bus that same evening, with both a new game to play and a very empty stomach. Nevertheless, I couldn't let that change my inner conviction that I had made the right choice. 2019 marks 10 years after making this decision, and almost 12 years since the official release. Today, we revisit the game that started it all, the birth of a legendary series that would forever be remembered. Uncharted Drake's Fortune released on November 19th, 2007. I talked about the road leading up to its release in my 10 years of Uncharted video, from Sony's desperate need for a system seller during the early days of the PS3 to the initial lukewarm reception towards its announcement and being jokingly called a Dude Raider. Drake's Fortune proved everyone wrong and turned out to be the success that PlayStation deeply wished for. Over a decade later, it's easy to forget what a groundbreaking game this was for its time. Of course, the series has made amazing progress since, in graphics, writing, a bigger variety of locations, and in spectacle. For that reason, nowadays I often see Drake's Fortune described as rough to make your way through. Personally though, I can't help but feel a great appreciation for this game. Yes, there were growing pains, the game had its issues, but every time I go back to this adventure, it hooks me in the same way it did when I played it for the first time in 2009. Thanks to a great story, a sense of focus, and most importantly, its own unique atmosphere, Drake's Fortune still deserves recognition among the other main installments. Together with you, I like to look back at the full game once more. Uncharted Drake's Fortune opens with a famous quote, a tradition that every next game would carry on doing. What's so great in retrospect is that the quote of the first installment, which talks about the true glory being yielded in the journey from beginning to end, may just as well symbolize the evolution that Uncharted itself has made.
I am here off the coast of Panama, where we just recovered what we believe to be the coffin of legendary explorer Sir Francis Drake, who was buried at sea over 400 years ago. Are you sure you want to be defiling your ancestors' remains like that?
You make it sound so dirty. Besides, thought you didn't believe me.
Well, I did do my research, and apparently Francis Drake didn't have any children.
Well, history can't be wrong, you know.
The opening cutscene manages to establish Nathan Drake as an interesting character from the get-go, by introducing him as an ancestor of a legendary historical figure, Sir Francis Drake. I always loved that particular detail because making the connection to the real world added an extra element of intrigue, while simultaneously giving Drake a more personal motivation to seek the treasure rather than just out of curiosity or to get rich. A common criticism before launch had been that Drake seemed too much like a generic ordinary guy, but that turned out to be one of his strong elements. You can relate to Nathan Drake, he reacts the way you would, and every secret he uncovers you find along with him. Elena Fisher serves as Drake's counterpart, and at this point the two barely have a connection yet. She's funding the expedition for her own interests, namely a video report about the search for Sir Francis Drake. Elena was a bit of a revolutionary character in her own way, because she was like the girl next door, not a cliché female video game character with overemphasized physical traits. As I thought about this, I'd be remiss not to admit that it made me chuckle somewhat because of the current debate whether Naughty Dog is going too far in pushing for these goals, but how they never emphasized on it and let Elena's character speak for herself, I will certainly commend them for. Drake and Elena find that the coffin of Sir Francis Drake is empty, confirming Nathan's theory that he faked his own death. The coffin does contain his journal, and the clues within will help them in making their next move, but not before they are ambushed by a group of pirates. Drake jokingly makes a reference here to a Panamanian prison, which Naughty Dog would later turn into a genius callback created through the flashback scene in Uncharted 4.
Shouldn't we call the authorities or something?
Yeah, that'd be a great idea, but we don't exactly have a permit to be here.
What?
Yeah, so unless you want to end up in a Panamanian jail, we should probably handle this ourselves.
What's worse?
You obviously haven't been in a Panamanian jail.
Uncharted has several of these blanks filled in by later games, some of which I really like and others not as much. It's obviously hard to avoid Drake's relationship to Sir Francis Drake being thrown out of the window in Uncharted 3 and 4, which I always thought was a shame considering it had given Drake's character that small silver lining for me in the early days. But I digress. You know what I absolutely loathe about most video games? That they tend to open so slowly. They start off with extensive cutscenes to give you as much context as possible, and they have these long tutorial sections teaching you all the mechanics you need to know. One thing that Uncharted has always done well is that despite being a story-driven game, you're put right into the action from the jump. The later games would do this in even more clever ways, like the train cliffhanger opening or the bar brawl centered around its new melee system, but Drake's Fortune nonetheless achieved to get you involved before it truly introduced the necessary details for the adventure. It's a fairly restricted sequence, the boat is very small after all, but at least you get to shoot and knock out a couple of pirates, taking away that urgency to want to play so you can pay better attention to the story afterwards.
Whole ship's gonna blow! We gotta jump!
Oh, wait!
What are you doing?
Okay.
Come on! Go!
Alright.
Once a boat with a turret starts shooting at the ship, it's on the brink of getting destroyed, and this is where the third and final main character comes to your rescue, which could of course only be Victor Goddamn Sullivan. Sully has a slightly smaller role than Drake and Elena, and although I've loved his character from the beginning, you can tell that Amy Hennig, the creative director of the first 3 games, wasn't quite sure how deep his connection to Drake was rooted at this point. It's clear that the two have history, they're very comfortable joking around each other, and they collaboratively choose to ditch Elena at the docks so they can keep the treasure for themselves. But some of Drake's reactions later on point to a less secure establishment of their backstory yet. We'll get to that soon. The second cutscene is, I believe, the longest one in the entire game, and again, it's meant to lay the foundation for Drake's expedition. He tells about the voyage of Sir Francis Drake, his discovery of El Dorado, and explains that the journal should lead them right to it.
And then swore his entire crew to silence.
Yeah, so this...
You see, Drake discovered something on that voyage, Sully. Something so secret and so valuable, they couldn't risk it getting out.
All right, Nate, just pretend for a minute that I don't really care about any of that stuff and cut to the chase, would you?
Man only interested in the climax. He must be a real hit with the ladies.
Never had any complaints.
Okay then, I'll jump to the good part, just for you.
Ho ho ho.
Huh?
El Goddamn Dorado.
While we're on the topic of cutscenes, they were clearly one of Uncharted's standout features. Not only because of the sheer amount of them, it was the way they were captured that was revolutionary for its time. Contrary to the standard way of hand animating them for games, including those of previous Naughty Dog projects, Motion capture was now used to achieve a greater sense of realism. This also meant that the developer needed actors that physically resembled the parts they played, from body height to age, in order to accurately generate the same movements. You can tell they were proud of their achievements, and rightfully so, as the original game included quite a lot of making-of material that showed the process of bringing these characters to life, which I loved checking out. At the same time, the technology was still in its infancy when compared to today. For example, facial animations did not get captured yet until Uncharted 4, and even the voice lines were recorded separately, directly delivered into microphones in a small studio for the first game alone. You can actually tell playing Drake's Fortune that the performances sound slightly off compared to all the entries that followed. Anyhow, it's clear that Naughty Dog had set a new standard here, and it won't shock you that every other PlayStation studio would follow their lead eventually.
No, I don't trust him, okay? That's why we need somebody here fast. So just get me a camera crew, and I promise you that... You son of a bitch. Hey!
Chapter 2 is more laid back, but a very enjoyable one. You explore the jungle and a giant tomb together with Sully, where the banter that would become a trademark of the franchise sees its inception. It's also where you encounter the first puzzle section, and these puzzles have always received some mixed reactions. On one hand, they are so simple it's almost insulting, especially in this one. The first puzzle requires you to merely look at your journal for the right order in which to push each button and do so accordingly. Then again, this is clearly a game that wants to keep the pace up. Getting stuck at one scenario for longer than a few minutes would completely take away all sense of momentum. For that reason, there is the hint system, which presents itself instantly when getting stuck. If you'd ask me, the puzzle sequences have always been more of a visual treat than a real challenge, and to me, that isn't the problem. This is a game you play for the story, not necessarily to test your skills. If that's what you're looking for, there is always crushing mode for an albeit different kind of challenge. Drake and Sully find a massive U-boat, and it's probably the first truly impressive sight you come across. 12 years later, Drake's Fortune's graphics have obviously aged. Fortunately, the Nathan Drake collection took care of some of that, but go back to the PS3 version and the amount of screen tearing, texture pop-in, the plastic faces, and the horrible anti-aliasing are hard to avoid. Then again, imagine yourself back in these days. This was a mind-blowing graphical leap over anything you'd seen before. I remember climbing up the tall rocks and just standing there, gasping at the view of the U-boat through the waterfall with birds flying over and sunlight shining through. Few games had looked this good. Also, the added extra details were impossible to overlook. Drake's clothes would actually get wet when jumping in the water. People couldn't stop bringing it up because these details were simply unheard of until now. In the U-boat, Drake discovers coordinates for a different island where the treasure of El Dorado, a large golden statue, should be held. He accidentally sets off an old torpedo and hurries outside, where we meet the villains for this game. Roman and Navarro were certainly underdeveloped. Each subsequent release has done a better job at fleshing out the bad guys to make for more interesting encounters. Drake's Fortune is a short game, and so the villains here are relatively one-dimensional, showing up in just a few cutscenes. Roman is an old business associate of Sully who is still owed quite some money. As a so-called reminder, he initially plans to shoot Drake until he realizes that Nathan is a much more valuable help in finding the treasure, and therefore hits Sully instead.
So, we square?
For now. But just in case you need a reminder...
Hey, come on, leave him out of it.
Yeah, don't you guys usually just cut off a finger or something?
That's far too vulgar. No, I think this will hurt him a bit more.
Now, whoa. Come on, Roman. He's got nothing to do with...
Sully! Sully!
You son of a bitch!
The U-boat then explodes, allowing Drake to make an escape, and this is where he finds Elena, still very pissed for leaving her behind, which she expresses with a heavy punch in the face. You rarely see scenes like these in video games, once again showing me how natural and human the writing of Uncharted feels. In contrast, Drake's not too long-lasting sadness over Sully's death is somewhat questionable in retrospect, especially looking back at their bond later established in Uncharted 3, where Drake's mental state took a massive hit following a similar situation with Sully at that time. Again, it's the first game in the series, it's incredibly hard to plan these things in advance, and if you're able to look past the tiny missteps, it's not hard to keep enjoying what the story offers. Together with Elena, you end up running all the way back through the tomb, shooting enemies left and right, to reach Elena's core and flee the scene. Now, these first 3 chapters are awesome, because they make for the perfect blend of what Uncharted is at its core. There is lots of story, great character interactions, beautiful environments to explore, a puzzle, combat, hell even the first attempt at a small set piece, something that Drake's Fortune otherwise didn't really contain anymore, we find in here. The opening hour may just form my favorite part of the entire game.
What am I doing? Okay, you just jump, count to 5, and pull the cord. How hard could that be? Oh, crap!
After Drake and Elena's plane gets hit and comes crashing down, they individually jump out and find themselves separated on the island. The game hits a massive stop in progression here for a long while, so you can spend an hour or two fighting pirates as you try to find or possibly rescue Elena. It sure doesn't help that each of the 3 chapters individually contain a whopping single short cutscene that barely move the story forward. On one hand, I get it, because at this point, the game truly wants to get you familiar with the core gameplay systems, but if you'd ask me, there was no need to make these parts this long. Gameplay-wise, Uncharted Drake's Fortune is the entry that feels most outdated, mainly thanks to the clunky animations that don't hold up as well. Running, jumping, throwing a grenade or rolling into cover, it all looks a little silly, and most importantly, it doesn't feel too great. Gunplay on the other hand, I have much less problems with. While the recoil and inaccuracy of the AK-47 is a bit extreme, the pistols, shotguns and grenade launcher still feel very satisfying to use. Enemies also react realistically to your actions. They try to dodge your bullets, and if you shoot them in their legs, they'll actually start limping and show visible signs of pain. I've always found it shocking how enemies appeared seemingly drunk and unaffected by gunfire in Uncharted 3, because quite frankly, even Drake's Fortune did this much better. No, the biggest gripe here is that there is simply too much of it. Shootouts happen in waves, so even when you think you've had it all, more enemies will spawn and cause you to feel sick and tired of them fast. On crushing difficulty, I remember breathing a sigh of relief every time I'd hear the music fade away, signifying that an encounter had finally come to an end. Melee combat is also not the best. Spamming square remains the better option, though it takes up lots of time. To this day, I am unable to pull off the more efficient brutal combo consistently, and this is coming from someone who has beaten the game over 20 times. Fun fact, Sony aggressively tried to push their 6-axis motion technology in the DualShock 3 controller. This meant that on the PlayStation 3, you were forced to physically move your controller around for accurate grenade throwing and to balance on logs which you would otherwise slip off. Thank God they removed it in the remaster. Now, like I said, not a whole lot happens in these couple of chapters. Dozens of repetitive combat sections are spiced up with a cool waterfall shootout, booby traps making you cautious of where to walk, a part where you climb up a huge fortress, a puzzle room that requires you to increase the water level, and a turret section where you feel incredibly powerful while it lasts. Eventually you find Elena, but are captured by the pirates, and the story can finally move on. Drake meets Eddie Raja here, leader of the pirates. Eddie only shows up in a few cutscenes, though he remains one of my favorite villains for his personality and hilarious back and forths with Drake. It's also the setup for an awesome prison escape in the form of an on-rail shooting sequence where Elena drives while you get to use a turret and grenade launcher to spectacularly mow everyone down. Even trees can be hit and realistically fall, making this an awesome last chapter before we arrive at the next segment.
Damn it! This guy's crazy.
Eddie, take it easy, buddy.
Well, you're out of luck now. And out of road. Now, give me that map.
Hold on. All right, you got me, fair and square.
Hey, don't move.
Relax, Eddie. Just getting the map like you asked. I said, hold on.
I am.
Well, hand it over.
Well, now, you told me not to move. Looks like you're gonna have to come get it.
Dai camo.
After a last confrontation with Eddie, Drake drives his car off the cliff and swims away with Elena. The next act of the game isn't exactly its greatest either, though I'll give it extra credit for at least having another character that Drake can interact with. This is where the jet ski is introduced, which was slightly controversial back in the days, as people didn't find these sections to be all too fun. You're limited in your movement on the jet ski, only being able to go forward while steering left and right. You're often completely exposed to the enemies and they will bring you down within seconds, especially the grenade launcher guys who can one-hit kill you if you're not fast enough. On top of that, there are exploding barrels scattered across the water which you'll carefully have to get rid of one by one. Unforgiving checkpoints seal the deal, and whether you're playing on normal for the first time or on crushing for the challenge, the jet ski parts will definitely get you on the brink of pulling your hair out. The last upriver level is more fun, featuring the most interesting environment and handing you a pistol that makes getting rid of the barrels much easier. That being said, unlike chapters 4 to 6, at least the story moves forward here. Having escaped from Eddie's goons, Drake weighs the risks and comes to the realization that he wants to quit. Elena, however, fully disagrees, driven by her desire to capture potentially huge findings. They argue, but ultimately settle on a shared goal of first finding a boat and then thinking about their next step. But before they arrive, 3 events drastically change both of their initial goals. For starters, Nathan finds out that Sully is miraculously still alive. Elena confronts him with new footage she shot after the two get separated for a brief time. But Elena later loses that camera too, and along with it all her proof of their discovery so far, after nearly falling through a broken bridge. When the boat they were looking for then also disappears right in front of their eyes, all they have left is a collective goal of rescuing Sully, or else, as Drake suggests, beating the crap out of him. Drake and Elena's inevitable romance that, let's be fair, you could see coming from miles away, begins to form here. There is a great scene where he shows her the ring he found from Sir Francis Drake with the inscription Sic Parvis Magna, greatness from small beginnings. We wouldn't find out until Uncharted 3 what a key role this ring would still come to play.
That somebody special?
What? Oh. Yeah. I guess you could say that.
Huh. I had you pegged as more of a woman in every port kind of guy.
Don't I wish? No, this was Francis Drake's ring. I, kind of inherited it.
Sic Parvis Magna?
Greatness from small beginnings. It was his motto. Check out the date.
29th of January, 1596.
One day after he supposedly died.
Wait, what are these numbers right here?
Coordinates, right off the coast of Panama.
Oh, so that's how you found the coffin.
Yeah, that's right. See, Drake left this as a clue to pinpoint the exact burial site.
For someone clever enough to figure it out.
Yeah, nice try. But we're still going for that boat. Yeah, I'm afraid this is as close as we're getting to El Dorado.
Chapter 13 is where the game truly picks back up after a lengthy and mostly slow middle section. It takes place on the north side of the island and it essentially starts the lead up to a much more interesting final act. Every element of the story presented so far comes together here. The villains get back in the picture and Sully turns out to be alive because the diary of Sir Francis Drake stopped that seemingly fatal bullet. You spend the next chapters exploring the ruins of a huge monastery and its surrounding environments. I love this part because it highlights what makes Drake's fortune so unique compared to every installment that followed. Rather than being your bombastic, globe-trotting adventure, there is a real sense of mystery to this entire setting. Greg Edmondson's fantastic soundtrack also contributed heavily to this, and I should absolutely give a shout out to. Moreover, I love how clever the level design is while you scavenge the island, making you return to points you were already previously at, yet give them a different dimension. For example, there is the church. At first you enter it through a hidden passage, take out a couple of guys and ring both bells leading to a secret passage. Later on, you find yourself up high in the same church where you swing across the chandeliers to look for a different way through. You'll return to it one last time with Sully near the end of the game, having found out that 2 secret passageways was apparently not enough already. Where in most games it would have felt like they were lazily repeating the same sections due to a restrictive budget, that's not the case here, because each encounter introduces a different way of playing or enhances the story. Eventually, separated from Sully, Drake and Elena find the treasure vault, and after completing its trials, they make a major discovery.
It's Drake. He never found it, he just died here. So much for greatness. Wasted his life. For nothing.
This is one of my favorite scenes in the game, placing an emphasis once more on Nathan's supposed relation to Sir Francis Drake. He is visibly disappointed in his discovery that his idol failed and met his demise in such an unforgiving way. However, there is no time for him to truly process this moment, as within seconds, Drake comes to an even more shocking revelation. Eddie Raja enters the room, deeply distressed about what he just saw. Out of nowhere, mutant creatures show up and attack them, forcing Drake and Eddie to work together, but ultimately throwing Eddie into the depths of the vault.
That's right, you ugly kunyuk! Don't mess with Eddie Raja!
Eddie! Eddie, hold on!
Sadly, this marks Eddie Raja's final moment in the franchise, as ever since, many fans, including myself, had hoped for him to somehow make a return. Small side note, but I always thought it was a missed opportunity that Eddie Raja wasn't featured in Uncharted 4. There was a perfect occasion for it in the Panama flashback, where instead of Gustavo, the Central American prisoner, it could have been Eddie that Drake was in heavy conflict with. Think about it, it was established that the two had previous encounters, even before the events in the motion comic DLC, Eye of Indra. If you'd ask me to deliver on the many calls to bring Eddie back without having to revive his actual character, it would have been the perfect bit of fan service, but maybe that's exactly why they chose to avoid it. Drake and Elena flee from the monsters, and the game almost turns into a sort of horror experience at this point. As a 14-year-old kid, I was downright terrified, exploring the dark corridors as mutants unexpectedly came running out. I hate to admit it, but I literally remember a friend coming over and me passing him the controller because I just wasn't comfortable playing through these levels myself. It sure didn't help that I was pretty new to shooters back then, making me feel like I lacked any control over these situations. In retrospect, it's a pretty cool way to change the standard gameplay formula around. Instead of safely rolling into cover and taking out enemies from a distance like you got so used to, you're now forced to keep a move on and use blind fire to keep the creatures at bay. Drake finds out here that these monsters are in fact the Spaniards who looked for El Dorado and never left the island. The golden statue is cursed and turned anyone who got close to it into the horrifying monsters you're surrounded by. Roman and Navarro capture Elena, setting up Drake's final objective before the story can come to its end. After a major fight involving both soldiers as well as mutants, he finds a way out of the underground bunker where he reconnects with Sully, and together they make their way to the idol's location. Navarro emerges as the true main villain here, aware of the curse all along and leading Roman to become transformed by the mummified body within the statue. They leave by helicopter, but not before Drake manages to jump on, landing on a cargo ship following some epic friendly fire. The final chapter of the game consists of 3 shootout sections, taking out each soldier and ducking back into cover as Navarro fires a deadly shot every now and then. The last boss fight itself is sadly painfully terrible, requiring you to perform the exact right actions it wants you to, which means that you'll either see a very smooth sequence on your second playthrough or one full of game over moments on your first. Alas, at least the payoff is there, with Navarro strapped between both the helicopter and the idol, pulled down into the ocean, and Drake and Elena having a nice moment before being interrupted by the only character who possibly could. I mean, he is called Victor Goddamn Sullivan for a reason. Traveling homewards with lots of gold, but without any evidence of what it is they saw, Drake promises Elena a next story to make up for it.
Sorry you didn't get your story.
That's all right. There'll be other stories. You still owe me one.
I'm good for it.
And that marks the end of Uncharted Drake's Fortune. Despite its flaws that people will quickly bring up, the first Uncharted remains a special game for me. Even more so knowing that I played this game 10 years ago, when standards were much different and without the knowledge of what was yet to come. I also realize I may be somewhat biased in my limited amount of frustrations with this game nowadays, simply because of how many times I've played it. I got totally used to the combat, I never struggle finding the right handholds or pathways anymore, and I'll easily look past the flaws within the story because I've accepted it for what it is. Newcomers who don't know this game in and out and who feel no connection to the franchise are bound to have differing perspectives. Still, to me, Drake's Fortune unquestionably stands out for one reason. Perhaps more so than any of the installments that followed, it's a focused Uncharted game. It may not be as grand in scope, it may lack in ambition at times, but it makes up for that by giving you the feeling that you're truly there. This is a fantastic journey you're seeing through by yourself from start to finish. It didn't have the most replay value, the adventure would last you a single weekend, and there was no multiplayer attached. These were flaws that were evident even in those days. Still, the strange disconnection that I'm left with is how much grander in scope this adventure felt at the time. A game I can now speedrun within hours felt like an undertaking back in those days. Where I confidently run through the mutant-infested bunkers now, I absolutely dreaded every moment a decade ago. Uncharted Drake's Fortune will forever hold a special place in my heart, not only for introducing me to my favorite series in gaming, but for being such an impactful experience on its own. That 14-year-old kid in high school had made the right choice, sacrificing a filled stomach for a game he'd be reminiscing about years down the line. But Uncharted Drake's Fortune was merely the start. 6 months later, a sequel came out, and it just so happens that sequel is turning 10 years old very soon. I'll see you again then.